So before we dive into the actual retouching, I want to talk a little bit about the workflow steps. I think it's helpful to kind of have those in mind before we get started, so that we sort of know the order of operations of what we're going to do, and we can do it in a way that is as efficient as possible. And the way that I think about my workflow is I kind of break it into two broad categories. You have what I call baseline retouching, and then you have creative retouching. And the baseline retouching is basically to make the image look perfect in its kind of natural state. So any sort of skin smoothing, basic contrast adjustments and color corrections and things like that to make the photo look normal and natural in its kind of natural state. And then we have creative retouching, which is entirely optional. You can do it or not. And that's where you would add any really intense color treatments or crazy contrast or any of those kinds of things. And I like to do all the baseline retouching first to make the image look as good as it can, sort of in its normal state. And then if I have a desire to take an image further with any really, like I said, crazy color treatments or things like that, then I do that after the kind of standard retouching is finished. And I find that this is really helpful, especially when you're just starting out, because when you're just starting out, it's easy to go too far with some of those crazy color and contrast adjustments. Or maybe you have several ideas of how a photo will look. And if you're kind of incorporating those changes into the entire retouching process, it's much harder to come back later and make changes to those things, or to make different versions of your image. So I find that getting it to where it looks really good in its normal state allows you then to take that work and build on top of it for any sort of creative decisions that you might want to make. And you can make many different versions. You can come back and change those creative decisions later. But it won't interfere with the kind of hard work that you've done as far as skin smoothing and shape and these kinds of more general things. So that's the way that I like to work. And that's the sort of workflow steps that I'll teach. But as with everything, everybody has their own style, and surely you will take bits and pieces of this and kind of adapt it into the workflow that makes sense to you and that you find to be really efficient. So anyways, I'll kind of explain each step now just very briefly. And if you want to make a list of the steps at this point, you don't need to memorize it all right now. We're going to go through demos with, I think, 6 or 7 different images and kind of repeat these steps. So by the end, it'll really make sense and it'll come naturally. But for now, I just want to sort of give you the roadmap of the steps that we're going to take. So that begins with the raw processing. Obviously, we need to process our raw files into something that we can work with in Photoshop. And then from there, we want to do any exposure blending that we might want to do. So if you're going to process the same image in 2 different exposures, maybe one for the sky and one for the subject, you would do that exposure blending first in Photoshop. And then we want to do any shape work. So if we're going to be doing any liquefying or any modifications to the actual kind of silhouette of our subjects, then we want to do that next. That way, all of the layers that we're creating on top of our base layers will reference the shape that we ultimately want in the final result. And then we want to do the rough cleanup of the skin. So any major blemishes, things like that. And once that's finished, then we'll get into the more advanced skin smoothing. And from skin smoothing, we'll move on to skin color correction. And then we'll go to eye enhancement. And from there, we'll move on to teeth and lips, and then hair enhancement, and then any clothing corrections that might need to be made. And then we'll do the overall color. So if the image needs to be a little bit warmer, a little bit cooler, those kinds of things, we'll take care of that at the very end. And that kind of wraps up the baseline retouching. And then from that point, we can move on to the creative retouching. There's less of a defined workflow for that because it really depends on the image. So we'll get into that more as we go further along, and we'll cover a bunch of fun ways to add really interesting and dramatic colors and contrast and things like that to your images. And we can also do the black and white conversion after the baseline retouching. I pretty much always retouch in color, especially with portraits. Even if I intend for it to be black and white, I'll usually do the retouching in color. And that way, if later I decide I want it to be color, or maybe a client comes back and asks for the image to be in color, I don't have to go back and redo all of my retouching again. So I would save the black and white conversion for after the baseline retouching as well. And once the creative retouching or black and white conversion are finished, then we would move on to any sharpening or grain that we might want to apply to the final image. And then finally, we would crop the image if it needs to be cropped. And then we would get it ready to be exported. So again, we're going to cover all of this in detail. So don't worry, you don't need to commit all of this to memory right now. But I think having that list in front of you will be helpful, especially as you start working on your own images. Kind of having that checklist will make sure that you don't miss anything and will help you to kind of remember all of the things that we did in this course once you start applying it to your own images. Okay, enough of me rambling on. Let's get to some actual photographs.